and welcome. Tonight we will gently travel back in time to explore the remarkable life of Giacomo Casanova, an 18th century adventurer and lover whose name itself has come to mean a great seducer. In this calm narrative, we'll drift through Casanova's story from beginning to end, his early life in Venice, his education and travels, his famed romantic adventures, and the winding path that led him through courts and prisons, across Europe, and finally to a quiet castle library in his old age. We'll hear about the fascinating people he met, especially the women who influenced him, and we'll listen to a few thoughtful words from Casanova's own memoirs along the way. Make yourself comfortable as we embark on this soothing historical journey together. Our pace will be gentle and unhurried, like a gondola gliding through the canals of Venice at dusk. Let's begin in the city where Casanova's story starts, the enchanting Venice of the 1700s. Imagine Venice in the 1720s, a city of shimmering canals, narrow alleys, and golden light reflecting off the water. This is where Giacomo Casanova was born on April 2nd, 1725. Venice at that time was a lively and decadent republic, famous for its masked carnivals and vibrant theaters. Casanova's parents were actors. His father, Gaetano Casanova, was an actor and dancer, and his mother, Zanetta Ferrucci, was an actress. Young Giacomo was the first of 6 children, raised in a theatrical and somewhat unconventional household in the parish of San Samuele in Venice. From an early age, Casanova showed sharp intelligence and curiosity. In fact, he was so bright that he was sent to the University of Padua when he was just a child. Believe it or not, the young Casanova enrolled at the university at only 12 years old, an almost unheard-of achievement. At Padua, he studied law and also learned about the world of the learned professions. His family had initially hoped he might enter the church, a respectable path in that era. So, as a teenager, Casanova received minor orders in the Catholic Church and briefly considered a career as a cleric. For a time, he was even a seminarian at St. Cyprian's Seminary, though he would soon be expelled for scandalous behavior. Even in youth, the mischievous and adventurous spark in Casanova could not be contained by monastic discipline. Casanova later recalled that as a boy he was sickly. He suffered frequent nosebleeds and illnesses, but he credited a mysterious old woman, perhaps a witch as the story goes, with curing him through herbal remedies and prayers. Whether through magic or medicine, the boy regained health and grew into a lively, curious adolescent in Venice's stimulating environment. With a keen mind and a taste for life's pleasures, young Giacomo soon discovered 2 lifelong passions: gambling and romance. By his later teens, as he completed his studies, he began to indulge in both. After graduating from the University of Padua, Casanova returned to Venice as a tall, clever teenager eager for adventure. He initially took on minor clerical work in the church, but his heart was not in the priesthood. The bustling streets and candlelit salons of Venice offered far more temptation. Casanova soon fell in with a crowd of young nobles and free-spirited companions. He learned the art of gambling in Venice's ridotti, elegant gambling houses, and developed a taste for high stakes and risk. Luck seemed to favor him, or perhaps it was his quick wit and bold nerve at the card table that earned him winnings. Either way, gambling would remain a lifelong habit, sometimes filling his purse with gold, and other times emptying it just as fast. It was also during these youthful years that Casanova discovered women, and women discovered him. Even at age 17 or 18, his charm was notable. He dressed fashionably, powdering and curling his hair, wearing fine lace and silks, and carried himself with confidence. He had a playful wit and a flair for flattery that drew interest. Casanova himself later mused that it might have been his wit, style, or even just his scented, curled hair that made him so appealing. But whatever it was, women adored him, and he adored them. His first great romantic escapades were daring even by today's standards. It's said that young Casanova's first affair involved not one, but two sisters at the same time, teenage girls of 16 and 14 years old. This scandalous menage stretched the morals of even libertine Venice. To make matters more dramatic, years later, Casanova would cross paths with one of these sisters again, and even, unknowingly at first, with her daughter, who by twist of fate turned out to be his own daughter as well. Such entanglements were the stuff of whispered gossip in Venice's drawing rooms. Casanova's early love life was already intricate and tinged with the forbidden, foreshadowing the complicated romances to come. By the time Casanova was in his late teens, it was clear that a quiet life in the clergy would not suit him. He had too much fondness for earthly delights. His superiors in the church grew wary of his scandalous conduct, and Casanova found himself expelled from seminary and out on his own. But the resourceful youth was not lost. He simply turned to other pursuits. For a brief period, he tried to be a soldier. Casanova bought himself a handsome uniform, a long sword at his side, donned a smart tricorn hat with a cockade, and strutted through Venice to impress the whole city, as he later wrote. The image of the young Giacomo swinging a cane with a jaunty fake ponytail and whiskered hair cut in military style paints a picture of youthful brio. He seemed to be play-acting through life's roles, one moment a cleric, the next a cavalry officer, searching for his true calling. Soldiering, however, soon proved too dull for Casanova's taste. Marching in line and taking orders did not satisfy his restless spirit, especially not when gambling debts were piling up on the side. Within a short time, he abandoned the military career as well. At just 21 years old, Casanova had already tried and left behind the paths of priest and soldier. He would joke in his memoirs that, finding military life boring and owing yet still more money from gambling, I quit the military. Instead, he turned to what came naturally to him: music and society. In 1746, around age 21, Casanova became a violinist in Venice. He played in the theaters and salons, a low-paying job, but one that placed him amid the city's social whirl. Though being an orchestra violinist was considered a humble position, often on par with servant status in that era, Casanova made the most of it. He later confessed that he and his fellow musicians would get up to nocturnal mischief, roaming the city at night and devising pranks for amusement. For example, they would stealthily untie gondolas moored outside grand homes, letting them drift away by morning as a surprise for their owners. They even sent physicians on false emergency calls as a joke. These antics, though harmless in Casanova's eyes, hinted at a rebellious streak. The young adventurer and scandals in Venice. For a time, Casanova's life under Senator Bragadine's roof was idyllic, But Casanova's own restless nature soon invited trouble. He had a penchant for pranks and risk-taking that even his patron's influence could not shield him from indefinitely. Over those years, a list of scandals began to attach to his name, whispered among Venice's inquisitive Council of Ten, the city's powerful governing council. Bragadin's patience and protection were not limitless, and Casanova was pushing the boundaries. One infamous escapade involved a morbid practical joke that backfired terribly. Casanova and some companions, seeking revenge on an enemy, dug up a freshly buried corpse from a cemetery and planted it in the enemy's quarters as a ghastly surprise. The intended victim of the prank was so horrified that he collapsed into paralysis from shock and never fully recovered. This gruesome joke was viewed as beyond the pale, even in libertine Venice. Not long after, another incident further darkened Casanova's reputation. A young woman accused him of rape. Casanova vehemently denied the accusation, claiming that the woman had actually attempted to deceive him rather than the other way around. He was eventually acquitted for lack of evidence, but by the time the verdict came, Casanova had already quietly fled Venice to escape the scandal. His patron Bragadin, a former inquisitor himself, had solemnly advised Casanova that it would be wise to leave town immediately or face the stiffest consequences. Thus, in 1749, at age 24, Casanova's first period in Venice came to an abrupt end. One can imagine him slipping away on a gondola at night, leaving behind the city of his birth under a cloud of disgrace, despite the fortune and friends he had gained. It must have been a bittersweet departure. Venice had given him patronage, love affairs, and luxury, but now its authorities cast him out for his wild misdeeds. Casanova was, at heart, a survivor. He took this exile in stride as the start of a new adventure. His first destination was Parma, a city in northern Italy, where he hoped to lay low and perhaps find new opportunities. What awaited him there was not a job or money, but something more profound: love. In Parma, Casanova met a fascinating young Frenchwoman, known to us only by the pseudonym he uses in his memoirs, Henriette. This 3-month love affair that blossomed in Parma would later stand out in Casanova's memory as one of the happiest and most genuine loves of his life. Henriette was cultured, witty, and independent, a woman of both beauty and intelligence, which was exactly the combination that captivated Casanova's heart. In his memoirs, Casanova writes with uncharacteristic tenderness about Henriette. They who believe that a woman is incapable of making a man equally happy all the 24 hours of the day have never known an Henriette, he declares. By day, he found as much joy in talking with her, in the meeting of minds and hearts, as he did in holding her in his arms at night. For once, Casanova experienced a deep emotional bond that went beyond mere flirtation or conquest. He described feeling a joy which flooded my soul simply from conversing with her Henriette. For her part, clearly cared for Casanova, but understood him perhaps better than he understood himself. She saw through his charismatic exterior and recognized the volatility beneath, the instability of his finances, his lack of a solid social position, and his fundamentally wandering nature. As much as she might have loved him, Henriette knew that tying her fate to Casanova's would be risky. And so, in a bittersweet ending, she chose to leave him. Before slipping away, Henriette discreetly placed a generous sum, 500 louis d'or, into Casanova's pocket, a parting gift to ensure he would be provided for, knowing his penchant for landing in trouble. When Casanova discovered the money and the farewell, he was heartbroken and crestfallen. The affair had ended as suddenly as it began, leaving him with only memories of a woman he would forever idealize. A biographer of Casanova noted that, "Perhaps no woman so captivated Casanova as Henriette. Few women obtained so deep an understanding of him." In later years, he would reminisce that no joy ever quite matched those conversations in Parma with his beloved Henriette. Back in Venice, however, none of this could protect him for long. The inquisitors even planted a state spy named Giovanni Minucci to befriend Casanova and draw out information about his Kabbalistic and Masonic studies, and to inspect his library for forbidden books. It was a sign that the authorities viewed him as potentially subversive, a free thinker who might challenge religious or moral norms. Sensing the walls closing in, Casanova grew more cautious, but it was too late. On July 26, 1755, the Venetian tribunal issued a swift order for Casanova's arrest. He was charged with affront to religion and common decency, citing his public outrages against the Holy Faith as the primary reason for his seizure. Early one morning, the police burst into Casanova's rooms. "It's him. Place him in custody," the lead inquisitor's agent reportedly exclaimed. The charges were sweeping but vague, likely encompassing his alleged magic practices, libertine sexual affairs, and blasphemous talk. The authorities saw him as a dangerous libertine priest, since he technically still held minor clerical status, who flouted morality. Without any formal trial, Casanova was handed a sentence: 5 years' imprisonment in the dreaded Venetian prison known as I Piombi. The Leads imprisoned under the Leads, 1755. And so, at age 30, Casanova's fortunes turned dramatically. He found himself locked away in the Leads, the infamous attic prison of the Doge's Palace in Venice. These cells earned their name because they sat directly under the palace's lead-covered roof, which made them punishingly hot in summer and damp cold in winter. The Leads were reserved for special prisoners, people of status, or those accused of political or religious offenses, and Casanova now fell into that category. Imagine for a moment the abrupt change. One day, Casanova was wearing fine clothes and walking freely in St. Mark's Square. Mark's Square. The next, he was pushed into a dark stone cell with only a small pallet bed, a table, and an armchair. The door clanged shut, and the lively sounds of Venice were replaced by silence, broken only by the distant lapping of water and the occasional footsteps of guards above. His cell was said to be the worst of the lot, extremely dark, with barely any light seeping in, and so low that he could not even stand upright inside. In the heat of summer, the lead roof turned the cell into a sweltering oven. In winter, the cold would bite through the stone. To make matters worse, swarms of fleas tormented him, feasting on his skin in the darkness. Casanova, accustomed to fine linens and perfumes, was now covered in bites and filth. It was a test of his resilience like none he had faced before. For the first few weeks, he was isolated and despaired. He did not even know exactly which of his many offenses had prompted his imprisonment. The authorities gave him no explanation. In solitude, under heavy guard, Casanova's lively mind might have been his own worst enemy, imagining dire outcomes. Yet, one thing about Casanova: he possessed an indomitable spirit and a knack for hope in dire situations. He wrote later of this time, Despair brings death, but prayer does away with despair, noting that whenever he felt hopeless, he would pray and find new strength. Though he was far from a saint, in that dark cell, Casanova remembered God. I have always relied upon his providence, prayed to him in my distress, and he has always granted my prayers, he reflected. That faith in deliverance, however slight, kept him from giving up. After about a month, Casanova was given a cellmate and then another. The company eased the crushing loneliness a bit. Through the intercession of his patron Bragadin, who, though shocked by Casanova's situation, had not abandoned him, he was eventually allowed a few small amenities to improve his lot. 5 months into his incarceration, Bragadin's influence got him some warm bedding for winter and a monthly stipend to buy books and better food. These little comforts no doubt revived Casanova's cleverness and will. On daily walks through a narrow loft above the cells, the only exercise allowed, Casanova's keen eyes noticed something in the attic. He spotted a piece of black marble and an old iron bar among the clutter. Quietly, he pocketed these items and smuggled them back to his cell, hiding the iron bar inside the stuffing of his armchair. When fate presented a tool, Casanova's mind immediately leapt to escape plans. Over the course of 2 weeks, whenever his cellmates were absent or asleep, Casanova labored secretly. Using the rough marble as a whetstone, he sharpened the iron bar into a makeshift chisel or spike. Then, concealing his work at every sound of the jailers, he began to tunnel, patiently gouging a hole through the wooden floor beneath his bed. He knew that directly below lay the chambers of a chief inquisitor. If he could break through the floor at a time when that room was empty, he might climb down and find a way out of the palace. It was a nearly impossible scheme, but Casanova was determined. For days he chipped away, bit by bit, telling his cellmates nothing. Finally, he judged that freedom was just a few days of digging away. He targeted an upcoming festival day when the Inquisitor's office below would be vacant. That would be his moment to drop into the room and slip out amidst the festivities. But then came a cruel twist. 3 days before his planned escape, the jailers entered and abruptly moved Casanova to a different cell on another level, a better cell with more light, as a capricious act of mercy. Casanova was helpless to object. He was forced to leave behind the nearly completed hole under his old bed, so close to escape, and could only carry his sharpened spike with him, hidden in the armchair. As he sat in his new cell, which ironically had a window view of the lagoon and more space, Casanova felt a wave of despair. He later wrote, "I sat in my armchair like a man in a stupor, motionless as a statue. I saw that I had wasted all the efforts I had made. I felt that I had nothing to hope for, and the only relief left to me was not to think of the future." It was a dark moment. All his meticulous work had been for naught, and freedom seemed farther away than ever. But Giacomo Casanova was not someone who languished in despair for long. His quicksilver mind soon flickered with a new plan, even bolder than the first. In the cell above Casanova's new quarters, directly under the roof, was another prisoner, Father Marino Balbi, a renegade friar. Through a narrow ventilation crack, Casanova managed to strike up communication with Balbi. Initially, they exchanged small talk and books. The educated prisoners were allowed to share reading material. But Casanova had bigger ideas. Using mulberry juice as ink, he wrote secret notes and tucked them into the binding of books he passed to Balbi. In coded whispers and notes, he gradually revealed his plan to the priest. Balbi was to use Casanova's hidden spike to cut through the floor of his, Balbi's, cell, which was the attic floor of the palace, and then make his way down into Casanova's cell below. Together, they would then break out through the roof. It was a daring scheme, requiring trust and timing. Father Balbi agreed. He too yearned for freedom. Casanova managed to smuggle the spike to Balbi, hiding it inside a hefty Bible that the accommodating jailer carried upstairs, along with a plate of pasta for the priest. With a tool in hand, Balbi worked night after night, scraping at the wooden attic floor. Casanova waited anxiously below, shooing away his cellmate by feigning deep, frightening trances and muttering of angelic visions to scare him, a tactic that played on the spy cellmate's superstitions and rendered him quiet and compliant. In the stillness of pre-dawn hours, Casanova would hear faint scratching above and reassure his cellmate and any curious guard that it was merely the sounds of an angel coming to deliver me, as he dramatically put it. So convincing was Casanova's act that the informant's cellmate stayed hush, perhaps half believing that something supernatural was indeed at work, as Casanova had foretold in his invented dream. Finally, in the early hours of November 1st, 1756, Father Balbi succeeded. A section of the attic floor gave way, and he broke through into the ceiling of Casanova's cell. Casanova quietly helped enlarge the hole until it was big enough for a man to pass. Heart pounding, he hoisted himself up into the priest's cell, leaving behind the astonished third cellmate, who was too terrified to join and stayed behind, likely convinced that meddling with this angelic rescue would doom him. Now Casanova and Father Balbi were in the attic space at the very top of the Doge's palace. Above them were the actual lead plates of the roof. With brute effort, they pried open a section of the lead roofing and emerged onto the sloping rooftop under the night sky. A cool, foggy dawn was just beginning to break over Venice on that All Saints' Day. The two escapees were greeted by fresh air and a dizzying view, but also a daunting drop on all sides. They were on the roof of one of the most important buildings in Venice. Far below glimmered the canals and the piazza. They realized they could not simply slide down the roof or jump. It was far too high to survive. Carefully, they crept along the roof in the mist, the city still largely asleep beneath. After some searching, Casanova found a possible way. A dormer window on the roof, barred by an iron grate that likely led into an upper hallway. Using the spike and their combined strength, they wrenched the grate loose and shattered the window's glass. It was a perilous maneuver. At one point, Casanova nearly lost his footing on the slick tiles and slid towards the edge, almost plunging to his death before catching himself. But adrenaline and determination carried them through. They squeezed through the small dormer into the attic space of the palace's main structure. Inside, they found themselves in a storage room. Exhausted, they rested for a short while on the floor, hearts racing. The city's church bells began tolling the early morning hours. Soon it would be dawn, and palace staff might arrive. They had to move. They located a door and forced it. It led into a corridor. Fortune favored them. Being a holiday, the offices were empty and the corridors silent. Carrying a coiled makeshift rope fashioned from bed sheets, which Casanova had prepared in advance and slung around his waist, they proceeded carefully. They descended flight after flight of stairs, passing grand chambers and galleries that they had only heard of, now ghostly in the morning dim. At one point, they encountered a startled guard. Thinking quickly, Casanova put on a bold face and convinced the guard that they had been accidentally locked in the palace after a late-night official function and were merely looking for an exit. It seems incredible, but Casanova's poised manner and fluent lies were convincing. The guard took them for misguided nobles rather than escaped prisoners, and kindly escorted them to the final door. By sheer nerve and luck, Casanova and Balbi walked out of the Doge's palace's main entrance into the open air, passing right under the noses of the watch. It was about 6 o'clock in the morning. The piazza was just coming to life. The two men made their way to the waterfront and quickly hired a gondola, blending in with ordinary early risers of the city. As the gondolier rowed them across the basin, the great onion domes of St. Mark's and the pink granite palace they had fled receded behind them. One imagines Casanova breathing in the free air with immense relief. To avoid immediate pursuit, he fled Venice altogether, heading west along the Brenta Canal and then onward. Eventually, Casanova made his way out of Venetian territory and traveled swiftly to Paris, where he arrived in January of 1757. His escape from the Leads was legendary. 30 years later, he would publish a memoir specifically of this adventure, titled Story of My Flight, which became popular across Europe. In it, he couldn't resist a note of pride at his own audacity. Thus did God provide me with what I needed for an escape which was to be a wonder, if not a miracle, he wrote, acknowledging both luck and providence in his breakout. He added, I admit that I am proud of it, but my pride does not come from my having succeeded, for luck had a good deal to do with that. It comes from my having concluded that the thing could be done and having had the courage to undertake it. Indeed, it was an exploit that few would even dare dream, much less execute. A New Life in Paris, 1757 to 1760. Arriving in Paris as a fugitive, Casanova knew he had a rare second chance at life. He resolved to make the most of it. He was in his early 30s now, tempered by hardship but unbroken. Paris, in 1757, was a city of opportunity for a clever man, and Casanova intended to turn his notoriety into success if he could. He later reflected on his mindset upon reaching Paris. I saw that to accomplish anything I must bring all my physical and moral faculties into play, make the acquaintance of the great and the powerful, exercise strict self-control, and play the chameleon. In other words, he had learned from his past. This time he would be more calculating, wearing whatever mask society required, be it scholar, aristocrat, or mystic, to ingratiate himself. This insight shows a mature Casanova determined to rise in high society by cunning and adaptability. His first task in Paris was to secure patronage and funds. Fortunately, he had kept contacts from his earlier visit. He reconnected with his old friend Jean-Jacques de Bernis, who had by now become the French foreign minister. Through de Bernis and others, Casanova learned of a pressing issue. The French state's finances were strained and new revenue was needed. Always imaginative, Casanova proposed an idea that would endear him to the government. He suggested the establishment of a national lottery. Such lotteries existed in Italy, and Casanova pitched it as an ingenious way to raise money for the treasury while giving the public a flutter of excitement. The proposal was accepted, and Casanova was made one of the trustees of the first French state lottery. He threw himself into the venture, even acting as a tireless ticket salesman, using his charm to persuade wealthy Parisians to buy in. The lottery was a grand success, bringing in revenue for France, and bringing a personal fortune to Casanova through commissions. Virtually overnight, he went from penniless exile to wealthy man about town. Flush with money, Casanova acquired elegant lodgings, dressed in the finest Parisian fashion, and began circulating in high society. He gained entry to the salons of influential figures, and even at Versailles. He soon encountered some of the luminaries of the era. For example, Madame de Pompadour, the famed mistress of King Louis XV, and prominent intellectuals like the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the polymath d'Alembert. Casanova's wide-ranging knowledge and wit impressed many. He had genuine intellectual interests. He could discuss mathematics, literature, or the occult with equal facility. But he also wasn't above using deception and showmanship to boost his reputation. One of his favorite tactics in Paris was to pose as an expert in the occult sciences, an alchemist and Rosicrucian who possessed arcane secrets. This was an age where even the educated were fascinated by alchemy, the quest to turn base metals into gold, and other mystical pursuits. Casanova exploited that trend masterfully. He hinted to the curious that he knew alchemy and numerology, and that he might even hold the secret of the philosopher's stone that could create gold or elixirs of life. In truth, he was no real sorcerer, but he had an excellent memory and a flair for theatrical charm, which he used to give the impression of supernatural insight. One of his most notable Parisian adventures was his elaborate con job on the Marquise Jeanne d'Urfé, a wealthy and eccentric aristocratic lady obsessed with the occult. D'Urfé desperately wanted to find a way to become male, so she could incarnate into a new body, an extraordinary belief she held. Casanova promised her that through a complex magical ritual, he could transform her into a young man, or at least help her soul be reborn as one. It was an outrageous claim, but D'Urfé believed him. Over many sessions, he performed mystical ceremonies full of mumbo-jumbo, involving astrological readings and alchemical mixtures. Each session, naturally, required generous funding, rare ingredients and such, which the Marquise happily provided. Casanova strung her along for years, extracting money and gifts, all the while knowing it was a farce. Deceiving a fool is an exploit worthy of an intelligent man, he quipped regarding such scams. By that rather unkind philosophy, he felt justified in duping those he considered gullible, especially if they were rich. Madame d'Urfé became one of his biggest benefactors, essentially bankrolling him for a significant period. Eventually, even her patience ran out, but that comes a bit later. Casanova's reputation as a master of the occult also brought him into contact with other famous mystics. He crossed paths with the Count of Saint-Germain, a mysterious figure who claimed to be centuries old and to possess miraculous powers. Casanova, a skilled impostor himself, recognized Saint-Germain as the most barefaced of all impostors, noting how casually the Count would assert that he was 300 years old and could make diamonds at will. It amused Casanova to meet someone possibly even more flamboyant in falsehood than he was. Meanwhile, with his new wealth, Casanova did not neglect the pleasures of the flesh. He continued to cultivate lovers across the city, actresses, noblewomen, and common ladies alike. He famously kept a small harem of young women when he later invested in a silk manufacturing business, even as his employees, a decision that did not help his business acumen. But at this high point in Paris, he enjoyed romantic and sexual adventures daily, seemingly with boundless energy. We must recall that Parisian society in the reign of Louis XV could be exceedingly libertine in private circles. Casanova fit right in. He hosted lavish suppers, attended masquerade balls, and charmed ladies in multiple languages. His talents did not go unnoticed by the authorities. While they appreciated the lottery success, they also realized Casanova could be useful in other ways. Thus, he received a discreet proposal to serve as a spy for the French crown. In an era of constant intrigue between European powers, a man like Casanova, well-traveled, multilingual, comfortable among all social classes, made a perfect clandestine agent. De Bernice, his patron, sent Casanova on a mission to Dunkirk to uncover a possible spying plot. Casanova completed it swiftly and efficiently, earning praise and a generous reward. He performed a few more such missions. Looking back later, with the benefit of hindsight after the French Revolution, Casanova cynically remarked that the ministers of that ancien regime were lavish with secret funds for their cronies, while the common people suffered, a system doomed to need a revolution. It's intriguing to note that Casanova, who benefited from the old regime's largesse, still could criticize its excesses. "All the French ministers are the same," he observed. "They lavished money which came out of other people's pockets to enrich their creatures. A revolution was necessary." These words, penned in his memoirs in the late 1780s, show that he was not oblivious to the broader currents of history, even as he floated on its surface during his prime. By 1758, Casanova had reached the peak of his fortunes. He was wealthy, connected, and living in the most sophisticated city in Europe. Ever restless, he invested in a business, a luxury silk manufactory, hoping to multiply his riches further. But business management was not among his talents. He spent extravagantly, mismanaged the venture, and allowed his indulgences, like showering attention on the seamstresses in his employ, to interfere with operations. In short order, the silk business failed, pulling Casanova's finances into a downward spiral. He began borrowing money to try to save it, sinking into debt. As debts mounted, so did other troubles. Around 1759, his protector de Bernice fell from favor and was dismissed by King Louis XV. Casanova suddenly found himself without high-placed friends in the French court at the very moment his creditors were knocking. To avoid being arrested for debt in Paris, Casanova had to act quickly. Ever the strategist, he sold whatever assets he could, packed up his belongings, and fled Paris in 1760. He assumed an alias for safety, styling himself now as the Chevalier de Saint-Galt, a title he would use for much of his later life. Under this new name, he left France in haste, embarking on the next chapter of his wandering life. It's worth pausing here to note, in the span of about 3 years, Casanova had experienced extreme reversals, from prisoner to wealthy socialite, then to indebted fugitive. And yet, Such was his resilience and love of adventure that one senses he relished the next challenge as he left Paris behind and set out once more into the unknown. Wandering through Europe, London, Moscow, and beyond, 1760s. With Paris behind him, Casanova entered a period of restless wandering through Europe. The 1760s saw him rarely staying in one place for long, as he tried to recreate his Parisian successes elsewhere or simply escape the consequences of his own schemes. Now calling himself Chevalier de Saint-Galt, a self-granted noble title, he moved through courts and cities with a trunk full of fine clothes, a head full of schemes, and an ever-present desire for romance and excitement. His first stop after France was the German city of Cologne, and then Stuttgart at the court of Württemberg in the spring of 1760. However, fortune did not favor him there. He lost most of the remaining money he had through ill-advised gambling and speculation. In short order, he was penniless again, a pattern that would repeat often. When creditors in Stuttgart threatened him with jail for unpaid debts, Casanova fled in the night to Switzerland. For a moment, in Switzerland, his weary soul considered a radical change. Could he perhaps find peace as a monk in a monastery? During a visit to the monastery of Einsiedeln, high in the Alps, Casanova was struck by the tranquility of the scholarly monk's life. Worn down by his wanton living and constant stress, he thought about renouncing worldly pleasures. But as fate would have it, at the very inn where he lodged while pondering this pious future, a charming new woman crossed his path. Casanova's old instincts reignited instantly. The pull of desire overwhelmed the brief call of contemplation. With a self-effacing chuckle, he later recounted how all thoughts of monastic life vanished overnight when faced with yet another romantic opportunity. The world had not had its last of Casanova just yet. Resuming his travels, Casanova crisscrossed Europe almost aimlessly, propelled by opportunity and invitation. He visited Albrecht von Haller, a renowned Swiss scientist and poet, engaging in learned conversations. In 1760, during this vagabond period, he also finally met one of the great minds of the Enlightenment, Voltaire. In Switzerland, Casanova sat down with the witty philosopher at his estate. They discussed literature and ideas. Voltaire found Casanova entertaining, if not entirely philosophically serious. Years later, Casanova would have a public spat with Voltaire in print over religion, but at this meeting, they were cordial. From Switzerland, Casanova drifted to Italy again, stopping in places like Florence, Naples, Modena, and Turin. In each locale, his routine was similar: meet the local nobility, often through his Masonic networks or letters of introduction, engage in love affairs. He charmed both married women and maidens alike, enjoy cultural sights, and then move on. In Naples, one of his romances took a dramatic turn when he discovered the young lover might be his own daughter from a past affair, a shocking realization that he navigated with a questionable moral compass, as was his wont. The details remain hazy, but such entanglements underscore how complex his personal web had become. By 1763, Casanova decided to take on England, a new horizon for his ambitions. He traveled to London, a city bustling with commerce and manners quite different from the continental courts. There, he had an audacious plan: to sell the idea of a state lottery to the British government, just as he had done in France. But promoting himself in London proved challenging. He did not speak English, for one thing. Ever resourceful, he placed an advertisement in an English newspaper seeking to rent fine lodgings to the right person, a pretext for interviewing young women, since as landlord he could choose a tenant to his liking. Through this method, he met a young woman dubbed Mistress Pauline, whom he quickly seduced and set up house with. Casanova being Casanova, this was both a genuine affair and partly a front. He needed a genteel companion to navigate society, and Pauline served that role. London society, however, was not so easily charmed by a foreign adventurer. Casanova did manage to gain introductions to some high circles. He even secured a brief audience with King George III by lavishly bribing intermediaries and perhaps using some jewels he had acquired, possibly borrowed from Madame d'Urfey's gifts. But the lottery proposal did not captivate the British ministers as it had the French. They were polite, but non-committal. Meanwhile, Casanova found the English people intriguing, but prideful. He observed, "The people of England have a special character, which makes them think they are superior to everyone else. It is a belief shared by all nations, each thinking itself the best. And they are all right." A shrewd and humorous observation that basically everyone is patriotic in their own eyes. He noted these impressions while also indulging in London's pleasures. However, things did not end well there. One particularly wily courtesan in London, known as La Charpillon, outfoxed Casanova, playing with his affections and humiliating him by never consummating their liaison, driving him to the brink of despair and even a suicide attempt. This unaccustomed defeat in love deeply frustrated him. Additionally, he contracted a venereal disease, likely gonorrhea, during his English sojourn, which left him physically weakened. By 1764, Casanova quit England impoverished and ill, having squandered money and health in pursuit of pleasures that ultimately eluded him. But true to his resilient nature, he recovered on the continent, likely in the Austrian Netherlands, what is now Belgium. He regained his health and decided to roam further. Over the next few years, Casanova undertook an astonishing journey of about 4,500 miles, traveling by carriage over rough roads through northern and eastern Europe. He ventured as far as Russia, an exotic destination for Western Europeans then. In Prussia, he met King Frederick the Great at Potsdam around 1764. The Prussian monarch, an enlightened despot, was intrigued enough by Casanova to offer him a minor post, according to one account. But Casanova did not stay. Perhaps the rigid military atmosphere of Frederick's court did not appeal to him, or he to them. Instead, Casanova pressed onward to St. Petersburg, Russia, where he audaciously sought an audience with Empress Catherine the Great. Catherine, known for her intelligence, listened to Casanova's pitch for a Russian state lottery, but flatly rejected the idea. She had little interest in adopting a scheme from a roaming adventurer, though she did allow him at court, where Casanova observed the grandeur of Russia and perhaps had minor flirtations with ladies there. From Russia, Casanova made his way down to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, arriving at the royal court in Warsaw. There, in 1766, he became entangled in one of the most dramatic incidents of his life, a duel with a Polish nobleman. The altercation arose over a ballerina or actress that both Casanova and a certain Count Franciszek Ksawry Branicki admired. Branicki, a man of high rank, he would later become a great hetman of Poland, insulted Casanova or vice versa, and honor demanded a duel with pistols. In the duel, both men were wounded. Casanova was shot in the left hand, an injury so severe that doctors recommended amputation of some fingers. Stubbornly, Casanova refused to allow it, and luckily his hand healed on its own, though likely with some lasting stiffness. Branicki was more gravely hurt, but survived. The duel caused a scandal at court, a foreign commoner dueling a count. Consequently, Casanova was expelled from Warsaw to smooth things over. After Poland, Casanova continued wandering to Vienna, where he had to keep a low profile due to the Empress Maria Theresa's dislike of libertines, then back to Paris briefly in 1767. In Paris, he tried to rekindle old connections, and of course, he returned to the gambling salons which he loved. But his reputation preceded him. Authorities remembered the Durfey affair and other scams. Not long after, in 1768, King Louis XV personally ordered Casanova to leave France. The official reason was likely the fallout of the Marquise d'Urfey's complaints when she finally realized he had deceived her. Casanova's occult charade had made waves in high places, and the king wanted no more trouble from him. Thus, as the 1760s neared their end, Casanova found himself notorious across Europe. His name was known, and not always in a good way. While this infamy sometimes opened doors out of sheer curiosity about the famous Casanova, it more often closed doors, as wary patrons thought twice about involving themselves with such a reckless and scandal-prone individual. Searching for fresh ground, Casanova turned to Spain, hoping his reputation had not traveled as strongly there. In Spain, circa 1768–69, he tried his usual approach, dropping names of important contacts, befriending local Freemasons and literati, and seeking an audience with the king, in this case, King Charles III of Spain. But Spain proved a tougher nut to crack. Despite months of effort, no significant appointment or patronage came his way. He wandered through Madrid, Barcelona, and other Spanish cities with diminishing funds. In Barcelona, one dark night, he was attacked, an assassination attempt by persons unknown, possibly aggrieved husbands or gamblers he had offended, and narrowly escaped with his life. Shortly thereafter, he got into some kind of dispute with the authorities and was jailed for 6 weeks in Barcelona. By the time he was released, it was clear that Spain held no fortune for him. Weary and disappointed, Casanova left Spain. The closing chapter of his wandering decade found him drifting back toward more familiar terrain, a brief stop in southern France, and then to Italy around 1770. He was now in his mid-40s. The mirror would have shown him an aging libertine, still tall and imposing, with strong features, but weathered by travel and troubles. Indeed, friends described him around this time as powerfully built, but with a worn, almost ferocious look about him. Prince Charles de Ligne, who met him later, quipped that he would be a good-looking man if he were not ugly, highlighting a paradoxical charisma that shone through an aging exterior. Casanova's once smooth complexion was pockmarked by smallpox scars and stress, his cheeks hollow, his prominent nose lending him a rather hawk-like aspect. His eyes, however, remained bright and full of life, quick to flash in anger or amusement. His temper had grown shorter with age. He could be touchy and rancorous, yet he retained a sharp wit that could make others laugh, often at his own satirical remarks. In conversation, he had a theatrical flourish reminiscent of characters like Harlequin or Figaro, which made his stories sparkle. One might think such a man would finally settle down quietly, but Giacomo Casanova had one more big act ahead, a return to his native Venice after nearly 2 decades of exile. The time was coming for the prodigal son to go home. Homecoming to Venice and final exile, 1774 to 1783. By the early 1770s, political changes in Venice offered Casanova a chance to return. The Republic occasionally granted amnesties to exiles, and Casanova, ever nostalgic for his home, longed to see the canals of Venice again. He began writing letters to influential friends and even the inquisitors themselves, expressing his desire to come back and serve Venice if allowed. To show goodwill, he took up some commercial spying on behalf of Venice while he stayed in nearby Trieste and Padua around 1772. He reported on trade and kept tabs on any subversive activities of other exiles, essentially acting as an informant in hope of earning favor. After persistent efforts, he succeeded. In September 1774, the Venetian inquisitors of state granted Casanova permission to return after 18 long years of banishment. When he read the official letter, which granted him free passage and safety in the Republic, Casanova says he burst into tears of joy. He was finally going home. Casanova's homecoming to Venice was initially triumphant. News of his daring escape years ago and his far-flung adventures had made him a sort of celebrity. Society was curious to hear his tales. Even members of the Inquisition privately wanted to listen to how he managed to slip out of their famous prison. He was now 49 years old, but still full of stories and charm. One of his first visits was to his old patron Senator Bragadin's household. Sadly, of his 3 dear patrons, only one, Marco Dandolo, was still alive by this time. Dandolo welcomed Casanova and even let him live in his home for a while. They fell into their old warm friendship, though both men were much older. Dandolo provided him a small stipend, and Casanova hoped to earn additional money by writing. Back in Venice, Casanova tried to live more steadily. He truly did attempt to rein in the excesses of youth. He focused on literary pursuits, working on a translation of Homer's Iliad into Italian, Tuscan dialect, writing a history of recent events in Poland, drawing from his experience there, and even dabbling in theater projects. He got his Iliad translation published in 1775, though it had limited success and few subscribers. He also entered into a public debate with Voltaire via pamphlets, defending religion against Voltaire's atheistic leanings, somewhat ironic given Casanova's own unorthodox life. In one exchange, Casanova asked Voltaire what he would give the people once he destroyed superstition, to which Voltaire famously retorted about delivering humanity from a beast without needing to replace it. Casanova countered that the common folk needed faith for social peace. This spat showed Casanova casting himself as a defender of tradition, perhaps in an effort to appear respectable in Venice's eyes. Yet, life in Venice was not as golden for Casanova as it had been in his youth. The city itself was changing, a bit stagnating as the glory of the Venetian Republic waned. Many of Casanova's old friends were gone. He had little money for gambling, which had been his favorite pastime. The beautiful young women he once seduced were now replaced by a generation who viewed him as an aging man. He still pursued pleasure, but with more difficulty. He lamented that there were fewer willing females worth pursuing, and fewer lively companions to indulge his impulsive whims. Venice, in short, felt somewhat dull and lonely to him now. During this period, Casanova received two personal blows that truly saddened him. His mother, Zanetta, died in 1776. While they had not been very close, she had spent much of her life touring and left his upbringing mostly to his grandmother. It was the closing of a chapter of his life. More painfully, he was present at the deathbed of Bettina Gozzi, an old woman who, remarkably, had been the one to initiate him into sexual life decades earlier when he was a teen. Bettina was the sister of one of his early love interests back in his youth, and the two sisters were the partners in his first intimate escapade. As she lay dying, Casanova comforted her, and she died in his arms. It was a poignant moment, the woman who introduced him to sensuality, leaving the world in his embrace. Casanova must have felt the inexorable passage of time acutely then. On a more positive note, in 1779, at age 54, Casanova found a measure of domestic solace. He met a simple, uneducated seamstress named Francesca, who was about half his age. Francesca was no great beauty renowned in society, but she was affectionate, down to earth, and devoted to him. She became his live-in companion and housekeeper, providing him a steady relationship that, if not passionate, was warm and caring. Casanova seems to have valued her loyalty deeply. After a lifetime of dramatic liaisons, this constant gentle presence was a comfort. Francesca would stay by his side for many years, one of the few women in his life not to leave or be left by him tumultuously. Casanova's financial situation remained precarious. His writing projects were not lucrative. Therefore, to support himself, he reluctantly accepted work as a spy and informant for the Venetian authorities once more, the very role he had dabbled in to earn re-entry. The inquisitors put him on the state payroll by late 1779, assigning him to investigate minor intrigues such as commerce issues between the Papal States and Venice. He was essentially paid by the piece for reports, a far cry from the glory he had known. In cafes and salons, he would subtly gather gossip about who was saying what, who might be anti-government, and report it. It was monotonous work and vaguely distasteful to him, but he did it to get by. Even in this humbler existence, Casanova couldn't escape controversy. He had long harbored a suspicion about his own parentage, a rumor that perhaps his true father was not the actor Gaetano, but a Venetian nobleman, Michel Grimani, who had been one of his mother's patrons. In 1783, Casanova imprudently published a satirical pamphlet that mocked some Venetian nobles, and in a veiled way suggested that the Grimani family had a hand in his birth. This was a grave mistake. The satire, full of biting humor, offended powerful people. It was essentially Casanova's revenge on Venetian high society for not fully accepting him back. But the reaction was swift. The authorities decided they had had enough of the troublemaker. That year, Casanova was expelled from Venice once again. Roughly 9 years after his triumphant return, he was forced to leave in disgrace for the second time. It must have been a heavy blow. Casanova was now nearly 60, an age by which one hopes to be settled and respected. Instead, he found himself a wanderer again, with dwindling prospects. The idea of starting over yet another time, in another land, weighed on him. As he packed his belongings, including manuscripts and letters, and said goodbye to Francesca, whom he left behind in Venice for the time being, possibly to join him later. Casanova perhaps felt more acutely than ever the emptiness of a life spent chasing ephemeral pleasures and honors. Venice, the city of his heart, had rejected him finally, and likely for good. Twilight years in Bohemia, 1783 to 1798. Forced to leave Venice in 1783, Casanova embarked on what would be the final chapter of his life's journey. He drifted to Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, where a friend helped him find a modest role as a secretary to the Venetian ambassador, Count Foscarini. In Vienna's genteel society, he was an object of curiosity. This older gentleman with a notorious past and 1,000 anecdotes. He became acquainted with Lorenzo da Ponte, Mozart's librettist, who later noted that Casanova was a singular man who never liked to be in the wrong. Casanova even had the chance to make a small contribution to Mozart's opera Don Giovanni, which premiered in Prague in 1787. It's believed he offered a few suggestions for the libretto to da Ponte, drawing on his intimate knowledge of Don Juan-like behavior. It's tantalizing to imagine the aging Casanova watching Don Giovanni, an opera about a legendary seducer facing judgment, and seeing shades of himself in the story. In 1785, Casanova's patron Foscarini died, leaving him once again adrift and unemployed in Vienna. But a new opportunity arose unexpectedly. An old acquaintance, Count Joseph Karl von Waldstein, a young Bohemian nobleman, invited Casanova to become the librarian at his country estate, the Castle of Ducks, Duchkov in Bohemia. Waldstein was a fellow Freemason and something of an eccentric. He was fascinated by the Kabbalah and traveled frequently. Perhaps he thought the worldly Casanova would be an interesting companion and a useful addition to his household for conversation and cataloging his books. At age 60, Casanova accepted. It was not a glamorous position, but it offered stable income and a roof over his head. So he traveled to remote Bohemia in the modern-day Czech Republic and settled at Castle Ducks, a stately, if provincial mansion, far from the sparkling courts he once knew. Here, the final chapter of Casanova's life unfolded in quiet contrast to the bustle that came before. Life at Ducks was secure, but, in Casanova's words, immensely boring and frustrating. He was effectively isolated in the countryside, surrounded by people who did not share his language, wit, or interests. The local society consisted of a few provincial nobles and the Count's domestic staff, far from the intellectuals and beauties of Paris or Venice. Casanova's health had also deteriorated. He suffered from bladder problems and other ailments of age, and the harsh winters did not agree with him. He complained of rheumatism and said he sometimes considered suicide out of despair. In one letter, he lamented that his life at Ducks was living among beasts, referring to the lack of cultured company. His employer, Count Waldstein, though kindly, was much younger and often absent-minded about Casanova's presence. At dinners, the Count might ignore Casanova or forget to introduce him to guests. The other residents of the castle, mostly German-speaking staff, found Casanova irritable and foreign, and they disliked him. Ever proud, he probably lorded his knowledge and status as a world traveler over them, which didn't endear him. He had few to talk to except, by his own admission, his pet dogs, a pair of fox terriers that became his closest companions at Ducks. Yet, amid this loneliness, Casanova found a new mission: to write his memoirs. He realized that the richest possession he had were his memories, an incredible tapestry of experiences across Europe. He once wrote, "I have lived as a philosopher, and I die as a Christian." And indeed, in his last years, he sought to philosophize about his life and set the record straight in writing. Writing became his salvation from ennui. He wrote in French, the language of cultured Europe, to ensure a wide readership. Day after day, often in his dressing gown at a small desk, he poured his soul onto paper, recounting his childhood, his loves, his misadventures, and the many notable people he had met. He held nothing back. The manuscript was candid and unabashed, as if he were having one last grand conversation with an imagined sympathetic listener. The memoir, which he titled Histoire de ma vie, History of My Life, grew to thousands of pages. He also penned other works during these years, a novel called Ecosamaron, some scientific and philosophical dialogues, and satirical critiques. But it was the memoir that would secure his lasting fame. In its pages, Casanova presents himself not merely as a playboy, but as a keen observer of 18th century society, offering vivid descriptions of cities, courts, and customs. He reflects on fate and freedom, vice and virtue, with the perspective of a man who had seen and done it all. Whatever I have done in the course of my life, whether it be good or evil, has been done freely. I am a free agent, he declares, affirming that his guiding principle was always personal liberty of action. He acknowledges his deceptions too, quipping with some pride, "I have more than once deceived without the slightest qualm of conscience both knaves and fools." Yet he also emphasizes the role of providence in his survival. Good comes out of evil just as well as evil comes out of good. I have often met with happiness after some imprudent step which ought to have brought ruin upon me, and I thank God for his mercy. These contemplative passages reveal a man who sees his life as a story of lessons and ironies, not merely indulgences. From time to time, Casanova got respite from ducks by visiting nearby Prague, a cultured city he enjoyed. In October 1787, he was in Prague for the premiere of Mozart's Don Giovanni, which must have been surreal, watching a dramatized libertine meet his fiery end, perhaps wondering what judgment awaited himself. There is evidence he met Mozart himself on that occasion, or at least was present in the same circles. Casanova even drafted a scene for a potential Don Juan play, though it wasn't used in the opera. In 1791, he also likely witnessed the festivities in Prague for the coronation of Emperor Leopold II, which included Mozart's opera La Clemenza di Tito. These trips were highlights, letting him briefly taste the social excitement he craved. In June 1797, earth-shattering news reached Castle Dux. Venice, his beloved homeland, had fallen. Napoleon Bonaparte's armies had forced Venice to surrender, ending over 1,000 years of the Venetian Republic. Casanova was stunned. The Republic of Venice ceased to exist, absorbed and later given over to Austrian rule. This meant that even if he had ever harbored a hope to return to Venice, it was now impossible. The Venice he knew was gone. The last tie to his youth and identity was severed. Perhaps it was just as well that Casanova was nearing the end of his life. By spring of 1798, he was 73 years old, and his health was failing badly. He had what was likely urinary tract disease, or prostate swelling that caused him great pain, and he weakened significantly. On June 4th, 1798, Giacomo Casanova passed away in the castle at Dux. By his bedside were a few loyal servants, and, one hopes, his faithful Francesca. Some accounts suggest she came to him toward the end. His final words reportedly were, "I have lived as a philosopher, and I die as a Christian." It's said he asked for a priest and received the last rites, reconciling with the faith of his childhood. He was buried in the nearby graveyard. Sadly, over years and turmoil, the exact location of Casanova's grave was forgotten, and it remains unknown today. In a way, this seems fittingly enigmatic. The great wanderer has no fixed resting place that devotees can pilgrimage to. Casanova's massive memoir manuscript was left behind, unread by the world at the time of his death. It was later discovered and eventually published in the 19th century, causing a sensation. Readers were astounded by the candid, panoramic view it gave of 18th century life, and by the character of Casanova himself, not just a playboy, but a scholar, adventurer, and survivor. As one modern scholar put it, his autobiography is a unique and provocative source on European society of that era, detailing everything from aristocratic customs to the everyday lives of courtesans and gamblers. Now our journey with Casanova comes to a gentle close. As you lay here, perhaps drifting to sleep, consider the extraordinary arc of this one man's life. Giacomo Casanova was much more than the caricature of a womanizer that his name has become. He was a product of the Enlightenment era, a talented, flawed human being who sought happiness in a myriad of ways. He was at times devout and at times impious, generous and selfish, brilliant and reckless. He lived on his wits and charm, rising from a sickly child of actors to mingle with popes, kings, and luminaries like Voltaire and Catherine the Great. He experienced the highest luxuries, feasting in gilded palaces, and the lowest degradations, chained in a dark cell under a lead roof. Through all these ups and downs, he retained an essential zest for life and an unyielding belief in his own freedom. In his twilight reflections, he maintained that a person must own their actions. Man is free, but his freedom ceases when he has no faith in it, he wrote, suggesting that believing in one's own agency is key to truly living. Reason and faith, he thought, should guide us hand in hand. Reason is a particle of the Creator's divinity. When we use it with humility and justice, we please the giver, Casanova mused. These are surprisingly sober insights from someone often remembered only for frivolity. Casanova loved and was loved by many women, each relationship a story, whether tender, tragic, or comic. From the two adolescent sisters of his first adventure, to the sophisticated Henriette, who broke his heart for his own good, to the loyal Francesca, who comforted his old age, the women in Casanova's life shaped him profoundly. He learned from them joy and pain, and in his memoirs he often wrote of them with respect and affection, notwithstanding the social attitudes of his day. In a way, Casanova's deepest passion was not just for women's bodies, but for their company and conversation, for intimacy in the fullest sense. His life illustrates the pleasures and perils of a life devoted to passion. As a gambler and trickster, he showed how fortune can swing dramatically. One moment he was a millionaire in Paris, the next a beggar in Stuttgart. He was resourceful, always landing on his feet after a fall, until age finally tamed him. He had a bit of the chameleon, as he admitted, adapting to survive under many skies. and he left us a gift. His meticulously recounted life story, which historians and readers have used to peek into the 18th century in all its color. It's ironic that a man who lived much of his life in scandal and subterfuge ended by documenting the era more honestly than many of his contemporaries. In the end, Casanova claimed he died as a Christian. Perhaps he sought forgiveness for his sins, or perhaps he found comfort in the faith of his childhood when facing the unknown of death. But one thing is certain: Casanova never regretted living fully. He once wrote, "I will begin with this confession. Whatever I have done in my life, whether it be good or evil, has been done freely." There is a peaceful acceptance in that statement, a refusal to disown his past. He embraced the tapestry of his experiences, believing they all had value in making him who he was. As we conclude this gentle narration, picture Casanova in his final days at Castle Dux, sitting at his desk, quill in hand, a silk robe around his shoulders, his faithful little dogs at his feet. He writes by the light of a lamp, the Bohemian countryside silent outside. In his mind's eye, he is far away, laughing in a Venetian gondola with a first love, or debating philosophy in a Parisian salon, or feeling the thrill of that moonlit escape over the Doge's palace roof. A slight smile curls on his lips as he writes the final lines of his memoir, laying down a life lived without restraint. He has captured history in stories, and in doing so, achieved a kind of immortality. And thus, dear listener, we leave Giacomo Casanova, lover, adventurer, writer, philosopher, to rest in the pages of time. His life reminds us that history can be as exciting as any novel, and that even in our quieter modern nights, the echoes of distant eras and daring hearts can lull us into dreams. Thank you for joining this journey. May your night be peaceful, and may you dream of Venetian canals and Enlightenment salons, of harp music and masquerade balls, carrying with you the calm assurance that every life, whether quiet or bold, has chapters of wonder. Good night.